Sherpas, where we discuss and share the secret sauces to empowering your team for today's leading digital transformations, working with sales enablement, operations leaders, IT leaders, and learning professionals. Today, we're super excited to be chatting with Eran Gil here. Eran Gil is the CEO of AllCloud, an up-and-coming phenomenal partner in the Salesforce ecosystem, and is also the former co-founder of Cloud Sherpas, which went through one of the largest implementation partner acquisitions in the United States. So really excited to talk today with Eran and hear a little bit more about his story and really what it takes to drive partner success, especially in this remote environment. A little bit of housekeeping today. This session is going to be recorded. We will then be posting it to Spotify and also share these resources with you via recording afterwards. So feel free to just tune in. No need to take too many notes. We'll make sure to wrap that all up. We'll spend the last 10 minutes addressing any questions that come in through the panelists chat. So feel free to jump in, ask any additional questions, and feel free to add myself or Eran on LinkedIn as well for any follow-up questions. So with that, really excited to introduce Eran here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in this world of partners?
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thanks for having me. First and foremost, I really appreciate the opportunity. So by way of background, I'm actually originally out of Israel and was born and raised there. I've been living in the States for about 18 years now, which is sort of as a result of co-founding Cloud Sherpas back in 2008. I actually came to the United States just to get my MBA and perhaps leave after a couple of years of work experience in the United States. But then along came the world of cloud, and we started Cloud Sherpas, and that was back in 2008 when we were basically considered a pioneer in implementing cloud services. In fact, in the first full year of operations, we went and spoke to 52 CIOs, so about one a week, and they all told us that the cloud, or the concept of cloud, is never going to last. And obviously that's a little bit of a heartbreak for a company that's very small and trying to make it happen. It ended up working pretty well. We grew fairly big. We were one of the leading implementation partners for Salesforce, the largest in the world for Google, and the largest in the world for ServiceNow, and ended up exiting to Accenture back in 2015. For myself, I then took a little break from the business world. I traveled the world a little bit. I dabbled in investing. I sat on a few boards, which I still do. And one of them was AllCloud. And AllCloud was a company that actually stemmed out of Israel, not surprising. Wanted to build a business similar to what Cloud Sherpas is, or was at the time. And I became a board member for it at first. And back to 2017 and 18, they decided that they want to be a global partner. And they were already a partner of AWS and a platinum partner of Salesforce. And to do so, they decided to acquire a company out of the North American region, North American market. At that point, they asked me if I'd be willing to be the global CEO, and so I did, and I jumped back in full force, but I did ask that I get to bring some of the people that have joined me in Cloud Sherpas and made it successful. So with me is one of the presidents of the business units of Cloud Sherpas, the CMO of Cloud Sherpas, and a few other folks, and then we continue to hire great people. So today we are a global sort of boutique, non-GSI, non-global system integrator, but global boutique firm specializing in Salesforce and AWS, presence in North America, both Canada and the US, in Germany, and in Israel.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to talk about the life after running a company at some point. I look forward to the distant future that I'll be able to travel the world a little bit more than I get to today. Having fun right now. Awesome. So, I mean, right now, like with everything that's happening, with COVID and just the rate of digital transformations that are happening across the board, right? With industries like financial services and insurance and real estate and government agencies that hadn't yet necessarily adopted technology the way that they were forced to in the last 8 months. Like, what are you seeing in the marketplace around kind of the demand and urgency around digital transformations? Like, are you seeing faster rollouts being demanded? Like, are you seeing just more technology being integrated into different customer stacks? Like what are some of the key trends that you're seeing that are pulling that demand?
So maybe just for context, the whole world of digital transformation started almost 15 years ago. Now, it wasn't as prolific. There weren't a lot of implementation partners. And there is still a process that every one of these ecosystems, whether it's software as a service or infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, the entire cloud stack is going through. And all of these vendors are evolving over time. And why I say that is because within that world, there were always the sort of the front runners or the vendors that were leading the ecosystems, but also the companies that were adopting earlier. So the early adopters essentially. And then there is sort of the crossing the chasm into mainstream and then the laggers. We aren't yet at the point where cloud is mainstream. It may be more acceptable, it may be more thought or sought after, but most companies have still not done anything in the cloud, and most, if not all companies have not completely transformed and transitioned into the cloud. So we're at a very low penetration of the cloud, and what we're going through in its entirety is probably the largest IT revolution and evolution that we will ever see in the history of at least my life. And why I say all that is because segment by segment have been able to adopt and select and adopt technologies at different times in different manners. And so if you look at sort of the world of SMB or the tech-oriented businesses, they now call them digital-enabled businesses. They were early adopters. They never really needed anyone to come in and do things on site, and was all remote. And so they were always trying to sort of be at the forefront of adopting the technology and also finding tools to get educated by or to help them with rolling out technology. And so I'll put aside that segment because it hasn't really been impacted by the way that we operate today, the new reality of today. The more complicated the organization is, and that's usually in larger organizations, which in different regions in the world, and we know it very well, are defined differently. So we'll call them very large middle market companies that could be up to 10,000 employees in the United States, or even bigger, obviously, the very large enterprises. They've traditionally been accustomed to very hands-on, sort of human interaction based, and also face-to-face interactions, rollouts and implementations. Selecting the technologies was all part of that. And what we've found playing in that sort of market segment is that once it's set in that the reality is here to stay, that this is the new normal, and you could call it a new normal or just another step in the evolution, that these sort of technologies, the cloud technologies, don't really need to be on-site rollouts or on-site implementations. I think we're finding our companies that we work with, and we're encouraging them to adapt their mindset that it doesn't necessarily require you or us to interact in the same physical space in order for you to be successful. However, I will say, generally, other than finding that they have been successfully adapting, and we've been successfully implementing projects across the board in very large enterprises, there are some industries, some verticals that are still limited by the fact that they're regulated, limited by the fact of turning the ship takes a long time and changing the mindset takes even longer. And those companies will need to find other means of selecting a technology, interacting with a partner, interacting with a vendor, and also ultimately integrating it and implementing it in their environments. I believe there's still a very big gap in tools that are available for organizations to do so. And when I look sort of through the marketplace, we're actually using one of the most prolific tools today in the marketplace to sort of bridge that gap. Unfortunately, it's called video conferencing. It's been around for many, many years in different forms, but another evolution of a technology that is now all of a sudden being adapted, not just in the business world, but in the personal world too. So I think organizations have learned and actually adapted and are finding a manner of doing implementations in a remote environment. I think some will ultimately go back to what it was prior to the pandemic. I think some will see a tremendous amount of value, especially in cost savings around not having to go back to the face-to-face, the physical interaction. And then there will be, and I believe in wholeheartedly, in when there's downturns or economic downturns or pandemics or black swans things, or even the global financial crisis that occurred in 2008, it creates a huge opportunity to recognize a gap and fill that gap. And I think today, and during this period, we'll find organizations, even like yourselves, that will realize and recognize that gap, and will come in, fill it, and then ultimately be adapted by and adopted by a lot of organizations to sort of bridge the gap that occurred due to the fact that we have to work remotely.
Changing the approach, absolutely. Now you touched on a couple really good points there when it came to both selecting the technology and the partner. Now, one of the common mistakes, and we've talked about this before, is that oftentimes companies will go out, even if they don't necessarily have experience vetting, for example, a new CRM, they'll make that choice in-house and select, a Salesforce or a HubSpot or well, really, those are the two most common selections we typically see. And then they go find a partner to implement it. What are your thoughts on really like building the right partner strategy to help you through this digital transformation? Really, when is the best time to engage with partners to have the most success on these projects? Is it before selecting an implementation? Is it after? And if it's before, how soon before the actual implementation selection process starts should you start engaging with a partner to understand your business?
Well, let me start by saying that if we're looking at sort of a very large organization segment, they usually have, in one form or another, a significant consultant or consultancy in their midst.
Yeah.
And so they usually rely on those organizations to help them sort of set the roadmap for digital transformation. I'm talking very large organizations. They could be the MetLifes of the world with 1 million employees, or the New York Lives, or really big banks, or any of those sort. And then obviously commercial organizations like the Coca-Cola Company and P&G and stuff like that. However, I think in sort of the middle market is where, and in middle market, as I suggested, still could be a very large organization with multi-billion dollars of revenue turnover every year. I think they usually struggle where they don't have those sort of advisors on staff in recognizing and building that roadmap. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that organizations do is at first engage with the vendor. And albeit being, we are very dedicated to Salesforce and AWS, so we do promote our vendors. I think the mistake they're making is first committing to the vendor and then figuring out whether that fits their processes how to amend the processes to fit the technology. One of the biggest mistakes, by the way, is deciding that your technology should drive process versus the process should drive technology and technology selection as a whole. So I think what organizations need to realize is that first and foremost, they need to talk to someone, and the vendors have their self-interest in mind. And it's not like vendors like us or solution providers like us don't, but we look at their entirety of their business, their processes, their business lines, and we try to amend their process first and figure out how the technology would fit their need, rather than their need needing to be changed or amended to fit the technology. And I can't tell you how many failed implementations occur because the technology was already acquired, so now I just need a partner to implement it. It sounded like a pretty straightforward implementation. You find out it's a lot more complex. The technology can't do some things that you're used to doing, so now I need to change my process. It's a lot harder to do in retrospect and first engaging the partner, having the discussion, trying to understand your business, figuring out how it works with the technology, and then selecting the right technology to do so.
Absolutely. And I can speak firsthand. At my former employer, we purchased the technology, and it was Salesforce, and Salesforce was ultimately the right solution for us. But then we made a wrong choice with selecting the partner. We had a very complex business model where we were a real estate marketplace. We were serving investors, but we were also doing all the underwriting of real estate transactions in-house. Like, it was not your cookie cutter kind of phone book CRM or B2B SaaS use case, right? It was really complex, lots of custom objects, lots of automation. And we ended up going offshore at the time because we were looking to make it more cost effective, right? Which is, a very reasonable objective for organizations to do. But there's many mistakes we made along the way that I'll share a little bit more, such as not having like an executive sponsor from the business. This was very much so an IT-led initiative, where there was a lot of misunderstanding between what the day-to-day business processes actually looked like versus what the IT team thought of the business, right? So I'll speak a little bit more to that. But before we jump into kind of some of the pitfalls to avoid when working with a partner, let's talk first about partner selection, right? When are the best times to, like, if I'm starting from scratch, right? This is a new transformation. Let's say, hypothetically, I'm a real estate organization. We've got 1,000 employees, and this is our first transformation. We don't know where to start. We've never worked with a partner before. How should we go about selecting a partner? What are some of the questions we should be asking? Like, what are some of the common kind of criteria we should be evaluating our partners on to determine if they're the right fit for us?
So I think first and foremost, there could always be the safe bet of going after the very large implementation partners. It's also the most expensive bet. Depends on the size of the organization and where you are and what you're trying to do. But if you're very early in the process and are just trying to figure out what needs to happen, a few things that you want to consider as it pertains to specialization or as it pertains to understanding your business. You have to, you first and foremost have to find a partner that would understand you before anything else, because there are a lot of partners that are highly specialized in the technology. In fact, most partners are first and foremost technology specialized, and secondly or secondary, they are a partner that understands a particular industry. I believe that at the end of the day, there is a lot of different considerations, but the first and foremost consideration that you want to take into account is will they understand the business? Will this project be a significant enough project for them to care and put the best people on the project? And do they understand and specialize in the technology? These are some of the things I would consider, but at first I would look for, and this is where the vendor does come in handy, is helping you understand who are sort of the ones that would fit the criterias that I want to sort of meet. And they could be, like you said, cost efficiency. Cost efficiency is probably the last thing you want to sort of consider when you're about to implement a platform that becomes sort of the basis to your business process. Truly, it's all negotiable at the end of the day, but that's not the number one, I think, sort of consideration in selecting a partner. Your first consideration should be the expertise, the specialization, and their willingness to understand your business and figure out how the technology could fit your business without you necessarily saying, okay, well, I'll have to change my entire business model to fit into this technology. And usually where you find that is with businesses that are technology first, or implementation partners that are technology first. And for instance, AllCloud, without self-promoting, we view it as, let's understand your process and the business first before we figure out how the technology could be amended for what you need. Because at the end of the day, a Salesforce, for instance, is a very amenable technology. You could really do a lot with it depending on your need. And I think that's key to the selection of a partner and selection of technology after that.
Absolutely. And I think like the understanding of the business piece is so important, and something that I think was a big part of why our implementation was a failure. Again, at my former employer, we ended up spending 2 years reversing it. And, if I had to point out like what were the biggest issues, like one was just the lack of business sponsorship, right? Having someone from the business that was equally as invested in making it a success as someone from the IT team. But then also just in the understanding of the business processes piece, we did do some interviews with leadership, but we never actually spent time with the end users to really understand what their day-to-day looks like, right? And especially in larger organizations, I think that's where some of the disconnect happens with like, oh, here's what leadership thinks might be the best process to implement versus how do end users actually work today, and what does their flow of work look like? And then how do we translate that into workflows in the system? So can you talk a little bit about, what are some best practices with talking with partners? Like when it comes to really understanding that business process before molding it into technology, how should, customers that are listening, what should they be asking of their partners to help them make sure that they're checking all those boxes and ensuring that, really the right processes and implementations are going to be built?
So first and foremost, long gone are the days that CIOs and IT are the leaders of those transformations. They're not the leaders, they're not involved, but they aren't the leaders. So lines of businesses, even to the extent when we implement things like infrastructure as a service by AWS, different parts of it, different services you talk to an R&D organization, you talk to a production, a development, and so forth. That IT is part of it, it's not all of it. And so the executive sponsorship can't be just the head of IT, the CIO, VP, IT, and so forth. It has to be also an executive sponsor from the biggest groups of users, whoever they may be. They could be an R&D organization, they could be a sales, they could be a call center management team, they could be a lot of different things. To me, the difficult part of not bringing in the people that are actually going to be used the tools day to day is exactly what you described. However, I can also understand when an organization thinks that it will be too much in the details and there'll be too many school of thoughts that will drive sort of a mishmash implementation or a very complex implementation. And there is something to be said about over implementing, over customizing. Users tend to want to do the one little additional change that would make their life easier. But that overall isn't good for the business for the long term. So the right approach needs to be definitely a subset of users that are engaged throughout the process. There is the concept of user acceptance testing before anything is rolled out today that is critical and should never be overlooked. And that is not the manager of sales or the manager of a call center or anything of that sort. That is the actual user testing it. And then sometimes it sends you back to the drawing board. But to avoid going there and going back to the drawing board after user acceptance testing, I would say that bringing in actual users is critical. And then making sure that you align or create a baseline of what the implementation means. So there's always a way to continue and evolve the technology, develop it further. Reversing it, like you suggested, is a very long and difficult process. And
I
over
know.
over customizing technologies is even, it could be a lot worse than sort of underdoing it. And so I'd say I would first and foremost make sure that the executive sponsorship doesn't only come from IT. And then secondly, I would definitely bring particular users, people that are going to be hands-on on the technology, and decide with them what is our baseline, because there's always a way to sort of roll out and then continue to reiterate. And I am a big believer in continuing to reiterate. That's sort of some of what we do too. We offer services around reiteration and changes along the way, because even after user acceptance testing, and even if they are accepted and the technology is rolled out, you'll almost always do some iteration.
Yeah. And I think we can talk about UAT on a whole separate session. I actually was able to witness how you guys run UAT with one of our mutual clients. And it was actually quite fascinating, like the templates that you guys had and the process that you had built out. And I think, again, that's something that in the evaluation process, I think a lot of people don't know to ask that, right? Like, hey, walk me through what your, the scoping and the change, the build out is like one piece of it, but how are you going to make this work actually successful, right? What does your UAT process look like? What templates do you have available, right? How does your rollout process look like? How do you train the trainers? Do you use webinars? What kind of documentation handoff do you provide? And on the documentation side, that was one of the biggest challenges we had in terms of reversing the implementation, because our partners hadn't handed off documentation in terms of what they built. And so then it became this massive guessing game. And I used a ton of different tools to be able to decipher it. But that was one of the big gaps. And so one of the things I always recommend to our clients is to make sure that with their partners, they're asking like, hey, make sure to hand over the documentation of what you built out, because you never want to have to depend on a partner to be able to get value from your platform. You want to build a relationship and get enough value from them that you want to continue that relationship and build more innovation. But you don't want to have a reliance where you're stuck and you're not able to use your own implementation. And one other comment that popped into my mind is one of the mistakes we made as well in terms of over customizing and over complicating things is didn't do a good, build, buy versus rent analysis when it came to kind of the add-ons on Salesforce. Like, again, we were in the real estate space. And so we wanted to generate documents. Well, we did all of that custom rather than evaluating a tool like Conga, right? Or a tool like DocuSign to help support that. Again, like lots of mistakes that were made, again, before I joined, but at the same time, like those are mistakes that have a lasting effect on the business, right? And I think, when you buy Salesforce, something that a lot of teams don't necessarily budget for is what are the additional tools that you're going to want to layer in that will really drive adoption, right? Asking your people to enter all this information in Salesforce, but not actually having a way to get value from that information, right? By being able to generate documents is a big miss. So there are some tools that can be add-ons to your existing kind of platform and technology choice that can make a big difference in really creating a platform that users want to use in a day-to-day and making sure that you're budgeting accordingly for that.
Documentation is always a pain,
Yeah.
and depending on who does it, it could be very good or it could be very bad. And the one thing that is, you could even write the perfect document in the first place, but then the iteration that a technology always goes through, that's the other thing. Then who is responsible to iterate on that documentation? And oh, by the way, you can't really scale a rollout without proper documentation that is iterative. or a process that is iterative, and that's a difficult one. This is also a gap in this space, because there's one thing to implement, there's another to document, and then there's third to continue to iterate on that documentation. That should be a pretty easy process, but it isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're up on time here, and we try to keep these to 30 minutes. So thank you so much for your time here. We were able to answer a couple questions here. There was one question that came in that was, any recommendations that you have on driving transformations for in an NGO in particular?
Yeah, I mean, there is no particular, I think, advice or recommendation in driving an implementation, but I think we touched on some of it, and the most critical thing for me is to find the right partner that actually understands your business and your organization, rather than if it's a business or not, your organization, and understands the needs and the overall processes that the businesses need to run based on the technology. And the one thing I would also say is understand if this is really the platform that is going to be the platform for basically your growth as an organization, your organization as a whole. Not always do they have to solve everything. Sometimes they'll solve part of everything, and sometimes they will be the actual platform. So finding the right partner, figuring out your process, and then making sure that you align the technology to the process is, I think, critical. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a recommendation for an NGO, but it is exactly what I would figure out first.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Eran, for spending time with us today and sharing so much of your knowledge around and recommendations around partner selection and really how to drive success with partners. Really appreciate your time, and looking forward to our next episode. Have a great one, everyone.
Thank you very much.